It is wonderful to see everyone this morning. Glad especially to see so many visitors. I know that many are in town for the holidays and be able to spend time with family, and that's just a wonderful thing. We rejoice together this morning as we are here as the family of God to be able to enjoy fellowship with one another as well. A beautiful reminder of all that we have, even those of us who may not be able to see as much family or friends or whatever the case might be during the holidays, if that's your situation. We have a family here, and that is just an amazing thing that God has done for us. As we think about the history of our world, we can probably think about many people who have had an enormous impact on our world. Perhaps, y'all are hearing a little bit of the history nerd in me, perhaps you might think of someone like Julius Caesar or Augustus Caesar. Someone who began the empire of Rome. Of course, it began in a different form of government, but it turned into an empire under the Caesars and became possibly, by many measures, the greatest force the world has ever known from a political and military perspective. Or perhaps you might think a little later in history. You might think of George Washington, the impact that he had, especially as a president, how he could have made any rules that he wanted to in terms of his office. He chose to limit himself in terms of his terms. He chose to limit himself in terms of many of his powers and made a lot of, I guess we could say, unselfish decisions that paved the way for future leaders. We could think perhaps of the positive impact of someone like a Florence Nightingale or Clara Barton, I believe, was another one, during different conflicts who put themselves out there in harm's way to try and minister to people who were hurting and were able to help them in many ways. We could think also, perhaps, maybe we might group the Caesars in this, I don't know, but of those who have had an impact in a different way. I can't help, for example, but in our own modern history, think of individuals like Adolf Hitler. Certainly had an impact on society. Didn't last long in terms of his leadership time period. Did not have as high of a body count in terms of civilians massacred as some other dictators, for example, Stalin, but still had an impact that has continued to haunt our world even to this day. Many men and women throughout our history, meaning the history of the world, have had a tremendous impact. And yet, when we think about these individuals, I want us to consider the fact that that impact has lessened over time in some ways. Meaning, the Roman Empire no longer stands. Meaning, George Washington's principles are somewhat diluted in terms of our last couple dozen presidents. Meaning, ultimately, while yes, the scars of Hitler's Germany still remain on our world, there's not nearly as much as there was 50 years ago. Impact comes and goes when it comes to the physical day-to-day operations of our world, when it comes to the machinations of those in power. And yet, there are some impacts that nonetheless go beyond our physical world. Let's start with a negative impact. When we think about impacts that have continued and even grown since the first person who introduced them, perhaps we can't help but think of the one individual through whom sin entered the world. Now it's interesting, when we think about the story of the Garden of Eden, we're actually told there were two individuals involved, but interestingly enough, as we'll see in a moment, one is actually credited with causing the problem in a different way. And again, we'll talk about that in a moment. But first two individuals, first two human beings in the world, given but one rule: there is a tree from which you are not to eat. Now, we may have talked about this before. I don't believe there was anything mystical about the tree or the fruit in and of itself. It was the fact that this tree has been forbidden, and by eating of it, the knowledge of good and evil will be imparted to you, because until then, They might technically know there's a rule, but they don't have a full knowledge of, oh, I can break the rule, until temptation enters. The woman is deceived. She shares with the man. He also eats, and together they violate their one rule. I want you to think about what happened as a result of that one incident. Eve takes of the fruit, eats it, gives it to her husband. He eats it. And from then on, you know what we're told? Sin entered. Now, you want to talk about impacts that have lasted. Not a single one of us, at least not a single one of us who is old enough to know right from wrong, could raise our hands and say, I have not been affected by this one man. That's how Paul presents it in Romans. Sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin. And so death spread to all men because all sinned. Ultimately, if you read a little more of the context of Romans 5, he actually places the primary responsibility in many ways on the man, because he wasn't deceived, and yet he acted anyway. Sin came into the world through one man, death through sin. Not a single one of us has escaped sin. Not a single one of us will escape death. At least not in the physical sense, unless Christ comes before we wear out this mortal body of ours. Imagine what would have changed if that one man, or we could say both of them, hadn't done what they did. Sin would not have been introduced. Now we could talk about all the philosophical and theological implications of that. That's not our interest this morning. It only took one. It only took one individual, one act, to cause that much of an impact. Why? Well, because we're not talking about armies and governments and nations and empires. We're not talking about the things that rise and fall, that come and go because of the nature of time and the fleeting essence of our world. We're talking about something beyond this life. We're talking about something that transcends the flesh. We're talking about something spiritual. Yes, while many acts may have deep and lasting impacts on future generations in the physical realm, that which is spiritual has a far greater expiration, or lack of expiration, if you will. Sin lasts. Sin lasts and brings death. And because of that one man, there's nothing that could be done about that. Do you not know, Paul would say in Corinthians, that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? If you've ever made bread before, you introduce something like a yeast or some kind of culture into it, it doesn't stay in one little corner. In fact, that's the whole point. You're supposed to knead it into the dough because it's going to spread throughout. And to use the technical term, infect the entire lump of dough. Now, ultimately with bread, that's what you want, right? But that can happen with things that are unwanted as well. Just one act, just one individual, and that was the result. All it took was a single act of rebellion to unleash sin on all mankind. Now, just for a moment, I want you to think, please don't verbalize out loud, that's not the point of this. I want you to think of the sins in your own life. I imagine, if you are like 99.999% of all human beings, you can't just recall every single sin that you've ever committed in your whole life. That would take far too long, and you probably wouldn't even have the time or the ability to recall them all. All it would take was one of those to have the same impact as the first sin. Now, in our case, sin has spread to the point that it's just here now. All it took was one. That's an impact. An impact that literally we cannot put a limit on. an impact that has stained the world. And yet, there is another man who made an impact. See, it goes both ways. And man, are we thankful that it goes both ways. Just as sin entered the world through one individual, death entered through sin, so God was able to change that state of affairs. Again, through one man. This is even foreshadowed for us right after sin enters the world in Genesis. If you look at Genesis 3 and verse 15, as God is articulating all of the bad things that are going to happen because of sin entering the world, he says something interesting to the woman. He says, I will put enmity between you, actually he's talking to the serpent specifically, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. And notice what he says, he shall bruise your head, you shall bruise his heel. There's a funny TV show Liz and I like watching sometimes. Individual has injured his foot, but someone else has injured their head. And so the one who's injured his foot needs to take the one who's injured their head to the hospital, but the one who injured their foot's kind of being a drama queen about it. And so he asked the doctor, well, which is worse, a head injury or a foot injury? And the doctor immediately says, the head injury. Duh, right? Who's going to come out better in this conflict? Well, I think the one who only has a bruised heel instead of a bruised head. Even with the introduction of sin into the world, which would not stop, would continue spreading, unlimited impact, quite literally, even with all that, there would be one coming who would bruise the head. That's what Paul continues in Romans chapter 5. As by one man's disobedience, many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience, the many will be made righteous. It only took one man to introduce sin. It only took one man to change the trajectory of the world. Now, of course, he wasn't just a man, but he became one. That's how God chose to change the world. Not by God himself, as we're talking, of course, about the second person of the Godhead. Not by him remaining in heaven and doing something. That's not how it could work. He had to become flesh. Hebrews chapter 2, we've talked about, although it's been a few weeks now in our Hebrews class on Wednesday nights. Just as the children have to partake of flesh and blood, so also he had to partake in the same. That through death, he might destroy him who had the power of death. It took one man to have an unlimited impact. You, Paul says, who were dead in your trespasses, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses. That cannot be overstated, overemphasized, the impact that our Lord Jesus Christ was able to have on the entirety of mankind. A positive impact that has far greater ramifications, far greater lasting power than any president, king, emperor, doctor, nurse, scientist, whatever we want to put in that category. All the people who have helped the world in so many ways. All the people who have invented life-saving cures for diseases. All those who have developed ways to help us live longer and live more luxurious and comfortable lives. None of that can compare to what Christ did. Because none of those impacts lasted the same way. No matter how many life-curing or life-saving cures there are, we still die eventually. No matter how many positive, beautiful, good deeds we do for one another, there is still sin in the world. But one man was able to have an impact that was unlimited by any of those restrictions. Jesus changed everything. Not as a spirit in heaven. That's what he was before he became man. He changed everything as a man on earth. That's this strange and beautiful comparison that Paul gives us in Romans chapter 5. One man brought sin, which had an unlimited impact. Another man brought salvation, righteousness, which has had an impact that countered the first impact. Probably information that we all already know. Pretty much everything that we talked about is not strange to us, I would imagine. But I want us to consider one more point as we begin to wrap up this morning. One man changed everything for the worse. Another changed everything for the better. That's the one that we follow as Christians here today. But that one man wants to change the world again, in a sense. It's part of his change, don't get me wrong. It's not that it's a different change. But he wants you to be the instrument of that change. He's the one who made it possible. We're never going to match his impact, of course. But he has gone back to be with the Father. And he has left his legacy to us. We now are the ones who are to continue the impact that he began when he rose from the grave. He wants to change the world through you and me. He wants us to be one of those ripples that continues out from the first impact. Without us, yes, that impact will remain. But he wants us to continue and make it spread further and further and further, to continue the momentum, to reach more people, to help others see what he has done. We go back to Genesis. It's interesting. If you're familiar with the very next event that happens in human history, after sin enters the world, Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden. Well, Adam and Eve have a couple of children. And the question, as you're reading through the narrative of Genesis, well, what's going to happen now? Maybe these children aren't going to ever sin, and we can kind of get back to the way things were. And then Cain, out of jealousy and spite, murders his brother. And while both are sins, it seems that the sin is escalating, at least in terms of its consequences, even with the next generation. A rather dismal picture of where mankind is going. And yet, even at the end of Genesis chapter 4, there's this little sliver of hope. Because another son is born after Cain and Abel. And he has a son. And we're told at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Now, we're not told those people were perfect. We're not told those people had escaped the shackles of sin. We're told those people are starting to try and move back in the right direction. Starting to try and have at least a limited impact on the direction that mankind is going. As we continue on in Romans. Romans is an amazing book, by the way. If you get a chance, just sit down and read the whole letter all the way through. Incredible book. Focused on the gospel and the beauty of the gospel, of what it means for each and every one of us. But as he begins to kind of conclude the book, in Romans chapter 12, he tells us, if we might skip ahead a few chapters from chapter 5 that we've been looking at, he tells us what that means. One man introduced sin, another introduced salvation and righteousness. What does that mean for me? I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Why? Why should I sacrifice myself for God? Well, because that's how the impact continues. Present yourselves, your bodies rather, as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable or logical service. Don't be transformed by the world, or rather conformed to the world. Be transformed by the renewing of your minds. You may prove what is that acceptable, holy word of God, or will of God. In other words, my sacrifice to be a part of that impact is what continues the unlimited results that Christ has made possible. We've probably heard many stories of people who were converted because their great-great-grandfather was shown kindness by someone who eventually taught them the gospel or something along those lines. We've talked about in our tactics classes on Sunday nights. You may not be the one who helps someone to the point that they're ready to say, I want to commit my life to Christ. You might just be the one who plants the seed. And you may never know that a decade later, that seed sprouts and that person becomes a Christian. You may never know the impact you've had. That doesn't mean you haven't had it. If we do this, if we present our bodies a living sacrifice, meaning I commit all of who I am, all of what I have, all of my ability, all of my time, all of my talents, to being the person God wants me to be, we can have that same unlimited impact, not on our own, but through what Christ has done. There's a beautiful statement meant to serve as an insult in Acts chapter 17. As Paul and some of his companions, they are being, how shall we say, certainly persecuted. They're being accused before a city council of essentially subverting the order of society, being troublemakers, trying to tear down the world around them. The description that is used is these men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating that the earth is a flat disk in this illustration, but I want you to imagine for just a moment using this wording that the world is a coin. On one side of the coin is a world full of sin and evil and death. On the other side is a world in which Christ, through what he has done, has accomplished something no one else could accomplish and brought life and hope and salvation to mankind. These men who make this accusation, they're used to the world like this, full of sin and death. They're used to trying to carve out their little piece of wealth and power out of that world. And they don't like that these men who have come to town have tried to do this. They've tried to flip the script. They've tried to turn everything on its head. Everything that people think, everything about how we see the world, they've tried to flip it around to something else. They don't like that. And yet they're saying that's what these people have done. Inadvertently, they are giving exactly the description that Paul and his companions would want to hear. You are having an impact so great, you are literally turning the world upside down. That's the kind of impact you and I can have. Maybe not something we'll ever see, at least not in that light. Maybe not something that we'll ever be able to taste the fruits of, if you will. But by committing ourselves to the work of the one who changed everything, we can have that kind of impact because he has empowered us to have that kind of impact through the gospel of Christ. I want to have that kind of impact on the world. Yes, it would be great if I could create some technological marvel. It would be great if I could invent a way to cure cancer or some other horrible disease. It would be great if I could do all those things, but that's not what I want my true legacy to be. I hope that's not what you want your legacy to be either. If in front of you, you could press a button and you could cure cancer over here, or you could press a button and you could save souls instead, I hope you would prioritize the souls over any physical thing in this world. That's not to say cancer or any other disease or any other hardship or trial isn't bad. But what's better? This life or the next? And don't get me wrong, the two are not in opposition to one another. I'm trying to help us see perspective. That's the impact that I want to focus my whole being on. Whatever else I may do in this life, even if I were to cure cancer, that wouldn't want to be the thing I would want to be known most for. I would want people to see me and say, he is a follower of Christ. And he tries to share the gospel, the good news of the one who changed everything with anyone that he can. The one who changed the world believes that you can carry on that same work. Do you believe you can carry on that same work? Are you willing to do what it takes to carry on his work? If you are, there is no limit to the impact you can have on the world around you. If you're not, you are helping the world to stay wrong side up. Because there's only two options that Christ offers. He says, either you're for me or you're against me. He who is not willing to take up his cross daily and follow me can't be my disciple. You're all in or you're not. But if you're all in, there is nothing that can stop you. Yes, trials may come, as we talked about in class. Challenges you may face, yes. But your strength is not your own if you are working in the kingdom. Christ has empowered you and I to have an unlimited impact on the world if we're up to the challenge. Many times it's very small. This week, as we spend time with our families, it may simply be acting as an example to those who may not know Christ in your family. It may be showing kindness to someone who doesn't think kindly of the church and showing them that maybe they don't understand God's people the way they think they do. It could look like so many things. But make no mistake, it is a challenge. And it's a challenge we are all called to take on. And I hope we will all take on. If you want to take up that challenge this morning and you have not, if you want to commit yourself to the one who changed the world, we would love to help you do that this morning. We would love to help you obey the gospel, to be baptized into Christ's body, and be part of his kingdom. Or if you are a Christian, you've been struggling, you haven't been dedicating yourself to passing on that impact, you've been letting other things come before that, we want to pray with you, to encourage you, to strengthen you as you try and make that right. Whatever the case, if there is a way we can help you this morning, please let us know as we stand and sing together. Zion's call sweetly rings over land and sea, bidding us look to realms above, while the light from